Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is James McReynolds, and I'm the head of public programs here at the Bullock Museum. Thanks for joining us today for Viva Texas Vino. This program explores all that Texas wine has to offer. So if you're not familiar with Texas wine, or if you're interested and just want to learn more, you're in the right place. For each program in the Viva Texas Vino series, we'll focus on a different grape variety, different type of Texas wine. You'll hear about that history, the wine flavor, and how it's produced. Since we can't do a wine tasting with you in person anymore, we're hoping that you have a bottle at home and you can drink along with us during the discussion. And for this program, I'm lucky to have as my co-host, Jessica Dupuy. Jessica is a freelance journalist who has covered wine and food for more than a decade. She's written about Texas wine specifically for Texas Monthly since 2007. She's also covered food trends for various publications throughout her career and authored 7 books. She's a certified sommelier through the Court of Master Sommeliers, an advanced certificate holder for the Wine and Spirits Educational Trust, and a certified specialist of wine and spirits in the Society of Wine Educators. Jessica, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, James. I'm glad to be here.
So can you tell us what Texas wine we'll be focusing on today?
Yeah, so today we're going to kind of dive deep into the grape known as Tempranillo. Tempranillo, for those of you that don't know, is a Spanish grape. It's grown throughout the entire country of Spain as well as Portugal. And it's known for those that are kind of generally wine enthusiasts. You may have heard of Rioja or Ribera del Duero. These are regions within Spain that specialize in Tempranillo. But if you have heard of that grape recently, especially in Texas, it's because over the past decade, it's a grape that's really started to shine here. And I'm not the person to jump ahead of the gun and say, hey, this is the star grape for Texas, but I will say that it's extremely promising.
That sounds great. I'm really excited to hear your conversation and learn more about Tempranillo in Texas.
Before we talk about specific Texas wines, here's a little background on winemaking, wine tasting, and how Texas fits into the wine world. It's no secret that people have been making wine for thousands of years all over the world. And while there are a number of different styles of wine made from thousands of different grape varieties, the general principles of winemaking are all pretty much the same. The basic requirements include fruit, yeast, oxygen, and time. Technically, you can make wine from any fruit, including blackberries, blueberries, peaches, and you'll even find pineapple wine in tropical places such as Hawaii. But conventional wine, as we know it specifically, involves grapes. While there are myriad varieties grown throughout the world, the simplest wine categories fall between white and red grapes. White grapes are used to make white wines. Red grapes make both red and rosé wines, depending on how long their red-hued skins are in contact with the grape juice during the winemaking process. The location of where a grape is grown, including its climate, soils, weather, and farming methods, all combine to define what the French call terroir. At its core, terroir is what gives the grapes, and by extension the resulting wine, distinctive aromas, flavors, and structure. Because of Texas's warm climate, the harvest season usually begins as early as the end of July and lasts throughout August, September, and early October, depending on the grape variety. Grapes are brought into the winery and prepared for fermentation in a variety of different ways, depending on the grape variety and the desired style of wine. Fermentation is the chemical process by which the natural sugars in the grapes are converted to alcohol and carbon dioxide, with the addition of either commercial or native yeasts. Following fermentation, the resulting wine may rest in steel tanks, new or neutral oak barrels, or concrete vessels to mature. This step is called élevage, and depending on wine style, this can last anywhere from several months to several years before it is transferred into bottles. Once wine has made it into the bottle, its next destination is into the glass, and hopefully enjoyed, along with various cuisines and among friends and family. So let's talk about tasting wine. It's easy to feel intimidated by what you're experiencing in the glass, but keep in mind that if you already know what preferences you have when it comes to flavors and food, you'll easily be able to determine what you like and dislike about wine. More than 85% of tasting wine has nothing to do with tasting at all, but instead with your sense of smell. You don't have to spend too much time trying to analyze the different smells you're encountering, but if you take a quick note or snapshot of the type of fruit characteristics, red raspberry, or pomegranate, or any other notes of herbs, earth, or spicy elements that you encounter, you begin to create a mental catalog for what you may or may not like about the wine you're about to taste. Your sense of smell is the first litmus test in enjoying wine. What you encounter on your palate when you taste the wine should hopefully confirm the initial impressions of fruit, earth, and spice aromas. Tasting the wine is what completes the picture you've already begun forming in your head. When you take a taste, consider a few things your palate is experiencing. Is the wine sweet, lightly sweet, or dry, which means not sweet at all? Do you taste more ripe or jammy fruit, or dried or stewed fruit? Are there earthy, spicy, or savory undertones? How does the weight of the wine feel? Is it crisp and light, vibrant? Is it broad and heavy with a drying sensation across your tongue and teeth, which may be the case with bigger red wines? Finally, how does the wine finish for you? Do the flavors linger in a pleasing way and continue to develop for a minute or two? Or does everything sort of fade away? Most importantly, does it make you want to take another sip? Taking note of all of these elements can be a fun exercise in finding a deeper appreciation of wine. The most important thing to always remember is to drink what you like, not what others tell you to like. With the basics of wine under our belts, let's shift over to a brief history of Texas wine. Texas happens to be the second state in the country to see plantings of European grape varieties. New Mexico was the first. With the arrival of Spanish missionaries in the 17th century, grape vineyards also made an introduction as a way to produce sacramental wine for church services. Though there is evidence of vineyard plantings in various parts of the state up through the 19th century, almost all wine production in Texas was halted with the arrival of Prohibition in the early 20th century. Some wineries were allowed to continue some wine production for sacramental purposes, but the only one that survived and continues to make wine is Valverde Winery, which has been making wine in the southern town of Del Rio since 1883. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that production in Texas really started to pick up. Texas is still up and coming in the wine world, but has significantly risen in the production of quality wines within the past decade or two. Today, the state has more than 450 permitted wineries and 8 American viticultural areas. As an emerging region, Texas has experimented with a broad range of grape varieties, from the familiar Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay to Merlot and Sauvignon Blanc. But as winemakers and grape growers have paid closer attention to the Texas climate and unique soils, lesser-known international varieties from warmer climates such as Spain, Portugal, and southern Italy and France have taken precedence in the eyes of the producers who are pushing the industry forward. Today, while Texas still makes some good Cabernet and Merlot, it's more common for Texas wine drinkers to encounter Mourvedre, Grenache, Syrah, Montepulciano, Vermentino, Sangiovese, Albarino, Viognier, Roussanne, Tannat, and Tempranillo. If you haven't yet explored the increasingly exciting world of Texas wine, it's high time you seek some out and try it for yourself.
So today, as we talk about Texas Tempranillo, it seemed only fitting that we would talk to some of the foremost experts on this particular grape variety in the state of Texas. So I want to welcome to the program that we have here, David Culkin with Pedernales Cellars and Neil Newsom of Newsom Vineyards. Just a quick intro, and then I'm actually going to let them talk about themselves because this is, their deal. But David is the co-founder and winemaker for Pedernales Cellars, which is located in Stonewall, Texas, kind of right between Johnson City and Fredericksburg out in the hill country. And then Neil Newsom is in a different part of the state. He's located in the High Plains, which is way up north, west of Lubbock, almost on the border of New Mexico. And so we're going to be talking about 2 different important regions for growing Tempranillo here. And these 2 guys can really kind of help inform us on what to expect from these 2 regions. So David, if you don't mind starting out for us real quick, just kind of give us a little bit of your background. Tell us, about Pedernales Cellars, and then we'll kind of jump into Tempranillo after we get an intro from Neil as well.
Yeah, no, perfect. Yeah, no, I got into this because my family, actually back when I was an undergrad in college, planted a vineyard out here in the hill country. And they did that honestly as a kind of, sort of part-time farmer type of thing. They did it about 4 or 5 acres back in 1995. And, they came into the business and sort of sought out anybody and everybody that they could learn from at the time to do that. And so that's a lot of the folks that are even now, like Penny Adams and Jim Thomas in the business, but also folks like Neil and Janice, who ultimately helped kind of teach them a little bit about growing. And they planted Bordeaux, Cab, Merlot, some Chardonnay, and some Sauvignon Blanc as well. That experience, it was a dive in for them to learn about growing and growing in the hill country in particular. But they had mixed success with those. Some of those varietals worked out better. Some were more challenging, particularly because in the hill country, we deal with a little more humidity, a little more sensitivity to that on trying to grow in our environment. And I myself, along with my sister, got kind of roped in periodically to plant and to harvest and to help during that. But we pursued other careers until about 2005. We decided we really wanted to get in and actually start a winery and start this business. And that led us to doing more experimental plantings. And that's what led us to things like Tempranillo and some of the grapes that we use to blend now with Tempranillo, like Mourvedre, Grenache, Touriga Nacional, and those that make up the majority of our vineyard today. So the winery itself, we started the actual winemaking process in 2006, ultimately got our facility full and running in 2008, and have been making wine ever since then. And Tempranillo is for sure the base of our red program. It's what we probably distribute the most of, and then do the most in terms of blending and composing most of our red wines. So, I can definitely get into why, but Tempranillo has been the varietal that's worked for us on the red side more than anything.
Perfect. Yeah. And we do want to know that why, which we'll get to in just one second here. And I want to be clear, we're starting with David because he's located in the hill country, and that's kind of where most people associate Texas wine to be. And it's certainly true in terms of wineries and tasting rooms. But I think that so many people are, especially when I talk to them or write about it, a lot of people are so surprised to find out that the majority of Texas grapes, in fact, about 2/3 of them are grown in the high plains where Neil is. And so, Neil, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. We're talking about farmers such as yourself who are responsible for making sure we've got some great Texas wine. And so if you could give me some background. You didn't start out as a grape grower, and now you're one of the foremost grape growers in the state. So tell me about the high plains and your background, how you got into it.
Sure. Well, I actually didn't grow up on a farm. I was in the ag industry. My parents owned a cotton gin while I was growing up, and I really wasn't interested in farming until I guess I was a senior in high school, and my mom and dad bought a farm to semi-retire to, and I went off to Texas Tech. And while I was there, my freshman chemistry professor, which was a Dr. Roy Mitchell, would talk about winemaking, all over the world. He would compare it to what Lubbock, Texas had in common with that. Years later, my mom and dad sold the cotton gin, and the group of farmers that bought it talked me into coming back to Plains to manage the cotton gin. So that's what brought me back to Yoakum County. Started farming on my own and bought some land. And I've always been interested in all kinds of alternative crops. Janice and I have tried growing everything, watermelons, peanuts, and almond, a lot of really stuff off the charts. And I remembered grapes one day, and I was just possessed by them then. I couldn't read enough. So one thing led to another. And that was in 1986 when we planted our first vines.
Okay, so it was the late 80s. Okay, that's great. Well, so now let's kind of shift a little bit towards Tempranillo itself. David, you mentioned that Portonalis is, focused, and one of your spotlight grapes is certainly Tempranillo. Why is that? After, the experimental time that your parents had in growing and all the experiences you guys had, what brought you to this grape as a promising grape for Texas?
Well, I think one is, and we weren't hardly the first in doing this, is just researching, looking at some of the comparable regions that had a lot of the same soil and, sort of climatic conditions. Tempranillo seemed like an obvious fit. And so as it is in Spain, it's a very versatile grape in terms of the blends it can work in and in terms of the different altitudes and soils it works in. So all of that made it promising to us, but we weren't by any means the first at the point that we planted it, because we could glean on the experience already that Neil out in the High Plains had with it, as well as like Jim and Karen Johnson here in the Hill Country, who had planted, I think like in '99, roughly speaking, they had put some in, but it was either that or like right in the early 2000s. And they were starting to turn out some really nice wines using Tempranillo, among other varietals. So that led us to put, when we put in experimentals, we put in Petit Syrah, Touriga Nacional, Tempranillo, a number of them. And right from the outset, Tempranillo is certainly the best of all of them. And it's both in a way that made it suitable for growing. It was relatively resilient. It had a fairly short window in terms of its kind of bud break to harvest time. And the quality was consistent. So we were happy to have that as the base. And one of the things that was attractive to Tempranillo was the fact that Tempranillo blends quite well. So we could incorporate other varietals, which, one of the things that we were sort of dead set on from the beginning is that some diversity in blending in a place like this, where the climate and the weather is so erratic, is a real benefit to your overall winemaking technique, because you're going to want to be able to rely on different varietals to come out, more strongly different years depending on the conditions. And the fact that Tempranillo can blend well with such a good range of varietals makes it all the better to base a program on, because we can always count on Tempranillo coming in, but we also then can work with some of the other varietals in order to smooth out the finished wines that we're going to get from that.
And I appreciate you bringing that up about the Hill Country. So, you guys release a number of different Tempranillos. It's not just like, here's our one Pedernales Cellars Tempranillo, but you guys have a Hill Country Tempranillo, you have a High Plains, you have a blend, and you have a reserve. What, and this is one of the things I love a lot about you guys, what made you decide that you needed to distinguish between these regions?
Well, for one, they're as far apart as talking about like Santa Barbara and, like Northern Napa or Sonoma, right? So in terms of distance, you would never confuse those two places if you were talking about wines from another region. And that's just as true here. Like when we pour a glass of Hill Country Tempranillo versus a glass of High Plains, they are certainly different wines. They may reflect, if they're coming from us, similar style, but they're going to be very different in terms of the characteristics, which for us, I actually would have to say it's kind of an asset. Tempranillo can express very differently, as will other varietals in these different regions, and it actually gives us more to work with, I feel like, when we're blending. And the other part is that given that in these different regions, we deal with vintages where, whether it's because of hail, because of freezes, or otherwise, we see a real drop in what we can do from one region or another vineyard year over year. Having it spread out, in effect, from a winemaking point of view, is a little bit of a risk mitigation too. We source from 9 different vineyards for Tempranillo.
That makes sense. So Neil, moving to, I think, David hit on a really important point here, and that's that you are certainly for the High Plains, but, between you and Jim Johnson, you guys are the first to plant Tempranillo, and doing so seemed a little crazy, probably felt a little crazy when you did it in the 90s, because people were still talking about Cab and Merlot. Who convinced you, or why did you get convinced to do it?
In the late 90s, and I don't remember exactly when, Dan Gatlin, which had about then become Inwood Estate Wineries, he was buying Cabernet from us, and several different times he asked me if I'd be interested in planting Tempranillo. And I said no. I knew what it was, but most of the world didn't. Probably 99% of the world, especially North America, knew what Cabernet was. What Tempranillo was. And then about the third time he asked me, and I said, no, Dan. I said, what if it won't grow here? What if it doesn't produce? There's a lot of reasons. And then what if it does? The market doesn't like it. No recognition. And he understood all of that. And he said, well, if I paid for the establishment of the vineyard, would you be interested? And I said, yes. That way I don't have to eat the whole enchilada if it doesn't work out. And anyway, that's also what started our co-op planting program. We've been doing a lot of that. Most of our vineyards from there until now were planted by agreements just like that, where the winery eventually gets their money back as it comes into production.
That's really
That's
smart.
what got it started. Dan Gatlin, it's all his fault.
We'll blame him.
Mhm.
But that, that's an interesting point. A lot of people don't realize, this isn't a crop that you plant at one part of the season and then you get your yield out of it 6 months later. This is, to get a good yield or a good crop out of a vineyard can take, yes, sometimes you might be able to get a harvest off of the second year, but usually you're talking for a good optimal growing vine, you're talking 5 years, sometimes 6 years.
Yeah, 5 years for full production normally.
Right. So that time investment alone is a little scary if you're not sure.
Yeah.
Lots of long-term planning, sure is.
Yeah.
So tell me, and we'll kind of get into this for both of you in terms of regions, because I know, David, you guys grow some Tempranillo in your family vineyard, so you're out in the vines as well. Mm-hmm. You mentioned a little bit that the hill country has, not as much of what people in the wine world call a diurnal shift. And so what that is the change in temperature, in our growing season, which is in the summertime. That's anywhere from 100 degrees during the day to what does it get down to in the hill country at night?
It can range to, you'll get those low 60s,
yeah.
Once we're getting this period and through the summer, but you can also have those summer nights, even in our site, where it's mid to high 70s.
Right.
When we get those hot spells, and particularly when that ground is starting to really retain that heat, it doesn't cool off as much as you'd wish. So.
Right. And so with that, the grapes grow differently than in the high plains. So tell me, David, and then we'll switch to the high plains, but tell me what some of the other conditions are in the hill country that would then affect these grapes that you're getting, the Tempranillo and the resulting wine for hill country specifically.
Sure. Well, and so you hit obviously a big one. It is that sort of temperature profile that is typical to the hill country. Without that shift, we don't have that same window. I will say the lower altitude and the higher heat also means that we're shifted to an earlier bud break and harvest window relative to the folks in the high plains. So we typically are budding out first week of March for a Tempranillo and harvesting those usually the first to second week of August. And that ranges a little on hill country. Some of our sites in Mason, they may be the latter part of August, but still most everything in the hill country will be picked by the end of August when it comes to a Tempranillo. So you have that going on. You also just have a little more humidity, or at least more humidity. It's like predictably at certain windows of time. We're in one of those right now where in May, we all can remember some of the really bad flood events, if you're in Central Texas, that have hit when you're in that kind of Memorial Day weekend window. And it's not uncommon to have some really heavy thunderstorms. And this is a sensitive time with the grapes, frankly, because with all that humidity and rain, you can really have some mold, fungal type problems that'll start to pick up now and really present a big problem by midsummer if you haven't stayed on top of it. So that affects a lot of the choices we make in terms of how we manage different types of sprays, in terms of how we manage canopy management. And some varietals just aren't suited to the hill country for this reason. You're not going to be able to manage that with really sensitive varietals, clusters that are really tight and close up. Tempranillo tends to be a relatively open and cluster, relatively resilient grape. So it manages that better than others that we've tried ourselves. Like Syrah is an example. Some growers may sort of talk well about it, but we've had a hard time keeping those healthy all the way to harvest with the humidity here.
Right.
So you've got all that going on. The other things you have going on in the hill country is a little bit more pest kind of problems. But I think that's mostly specific to the fact that we're not, anybody's been on the high plains, there's not a lot of trees. There's not a lot of sort of other wildlife here. The vineyards are sort of like a one-off in what is otherwise mostly oaks, cedars, and lots of, creeks and riparian areas. And that just means a lot more insects, a lot more raccoons, a lot more birds. All of that means we have to be much more sort of, thoughtful about how we manage those, how we use beneficials or use netting and all of the things that we have to get it done. We also source from the high plains because they can really do some beautiful fruit, and they can do it when we want to do like a larger planting in a way that, it took us several weeks just to do 3 acres more planting this year because we were just digging in rocks. It's a lot everything like that is more challenging in the hill country by and large because the terrain and the soil and all of it is less hospitable for this. So
yeah, that's a really good explanation. So to segue into that, as you said, the High Plains is nothing like that, nothing like the hill country. So Neil, tell us a little bit about what you're dealing with. I mean, we can start with those temperature shifts. I know that I've heard that, especially a little bit before, climate change, we were seeing, or Kim McPherson of McPherson Cellars was talking about seeing temperatures, in the 50s and in the nighttime during the growing season, which is a big shift from 100 to 110 degrees during the day. But tell us more about the growing conditions in the High Plains and what we can expect from Tempranillo in the High Plains because of that.
Okay. Well, again, we're a high desert plateau, very limited rainfall. As David said, there's no trees, which is not entirely true. There's 2 in my yard, and there's another one somewhere. I saw it when I was little. But because there's no trees, we don't worry about the birds and a lot of wildlife. And with the hot weather we have and the irrigation that we have, which was originally set up for cotton back in the good old days, we can feed the vineyards exactly what they need water-wise and manage the canopy that way. That's called partial root zone drying or controlled deficit irrigation. And at the same time, we can microfeed the nutrients and stuff that the vines might need, so they get exactly what they need when they need it. As David said, we've swapped a couple of issues because of our low humidity. We don't have much disease or insect pressure. And we've swapped with David with severe weather issues. This time of year when a thunderstorm comes up, it's nearly always a hailstorm involved. So we're dry as we can be right now, and everybody wants a rain, but you got to be careful what you wish for this time of year. We have a winter, what's called winter kill or winter damage issue. We can lose a lot of the permanent wood, which is the trunks or the cordons. We can lose those because of severe or really rapid weather changes in the wintertime. We have these false springs where it would be 70 and 80 degrees for a week, and then the next morning it's 13 degrees. Vines have trouble acclimating back to that quick enough. So that's one of our big issues besides the hail.
Okay, excellent. Well, so we've talked about the growing conditions of these regions and the weather and what to expect in the vineyard. I feel like we should talk about what to expect in the glass. And this is where I think, David, you can speak to that, having the 2 different regional releases and being able to really kind of distinguish these regions, which I think is really important. But what do you, I know you have your winemaking style and this is what Pedernales does, but at the same time, what are you expecting when you take a whiff of hill country Tempranillo versus High Plains?
So both Tempranillo, almost universally, both hill country and High Plains will tend to have a fruit note that's kind of like a cherry stone fruit kind of note. Now, granted, that can range, like in the hill country, it tends to be more of like a dark cherry kind of a quality to it. In the High Plains, it can be this kind of more bright red cherry smell and even pick up some other red fruit kind of components, like a little bit of strawberry or raspberry to it. Plus, the hill country, you'll get this kind of, it's like a mushroom truffle kind of like, mineral and earthiness to it. Whereas the High Plains, we typically get this like almost sort of sandy or dustier component to it. And some of these really are terroir in the sense that that's what's a lot of what's in the environment, right? We'll get this kind of almost spice like note that's coming from the cedar as well that you'll pick up in there. And that's pervasive in most hill country wines, and it's expressed more or less in certain varietals, I suppose, just depending on its profile. But it's definitely there in most of the Tempranillos we do. And I would say that we're not unique in that sense, that most of the growers here want to embrace that and kind of bring it out. So what we're often trying to do in terms of the winemaking side is we're introducing oak and other components on, and possibly even some blends with other varietals in the end, but not to really hide those, but then to build out around those. Because, for example, too much oak, Tempranillo is a varietal that you can put a whole bunch of new oak on it, and unless you're talking about the rare, really concentrated vintages, at least in many cases, you can wind up with that kind of over-oaked quality to it. You'll lose some of that natural aromatic and flavor that it has.
Right. Neil, you grow, David buys your fruit, but you grow for a lot of different vineyards. We've mentioned, or wineries. We've mentioned Inwood Estates. There's Bending Branch. I think Lewis Wines at some point was buying from you. You've had a number of different wineries. And so I'm curious, to build on what David said, Pedernales has a certain style. And I think one of the things I like about their style is that they really do try. I mean, they use oak and everything, but there's clear presence of fruit that is an expression of the vineyard. But we don't necessarily have in Texas one style of Texas Tempranillo. Would y'all agree? So Neil, kind of building on the fact that you're working with a lot of different people who are interpreting that fruit that you give them into different styles, what are you seeing? Are you seeing, a range that's kind of fun, or what are your experiences so far?
Well, absolutely. It's a lot of fun. We have 16 varieties, and we grow for 15 or 16 different wineries every year. And not all of them get all the varieties. That's a lot of different combinations. But all of them have something they're very good at. Mm. And just like we've talked about style, they may be completely different wines, but they're absolutely luscious just the way they're made. There's Old World, New World, and then everything in between. So it just goes and goes. And we get asked all the time, well, which one is your favorite one? I said, well, I'd have to tell you which one of my kids is my favorite first before I do that, because they all have strengths. I mean, they all can do it.
Right. And I think it goes to show, and, David, maybe you can speak to this, that, because I do get asked this a lot, which is, what is Texas Tempranillo? If we can say, I'm tasting this Spanish Rioja blind and versus a Spanish Ribera del Duero, you can usually distinguish between the two. And but how do you think we're there yet in terms of saying this is Texas Tempranillo, or do you think we are still kind of working out with different styles?
I think we're getting closer. There's a few things. I mean, a lot of it is the youth of this industry. It's also goes to points of what I was talking about before, that you're growing over a lot of sites spread over a wide area, and so those differences still shine through, and you can't always, whether it's a somm or it's just a consumer who's trying one of these wines, they don't necessarily have insight in every case into the different components to those wines. And I think as time goes by, there's like a feedback loop. I kind of feel it's there, and I feel like it'll continue to get there, which is to define the sort of idealized typicity for a Texas wine, for Tempranillo as an example. And as that goes, that will both drive how we grow them in the vineyard and what winemakers are doing, because they'll be trying to continually target that. Like I look forward to it, and also like I sort of shudder at the thought of that sometimes, because one of the things that's been fun in this industry is that we do a lot of experimentation. We kind of feed off of each other a lot too. When someone down the road is trying out something new, we have a tendency to say, hey, why not? We'll try that out. So like for me in the last 13 years, a lot of the variation in our Tempranillo has both been bringing on new sites and those sites maturing, but it's also been us incorporating experiments from other folks who come into this. I would expect there's a time in, say, 10, 20 years where it's pretty typical. Like you would go and get 10 Tempranillos and you'd basically say a Texas Tempranillo is X, Y, and Z. And that'll be a function of us dialing in more and more what we believe is the best we can do with it. But let's hope too that it continues to have these elements of experimentation, because I don't really want that, at least for me as a consumer. I would like it to both be identifiable as true to that region, but truly unique in terms of what the winemakers are doing with it. And right now, I think it's just a little bit, it's a little bit too fluid for us to nail that down. But it takes time, I think, for everybody to recognize that consistency, what it is that is unique to the Texas part of that profile. So
right, that's really great. So speaking about all this wine, it's probably worth saying that, if we're going to talk about it all, we could taste a little bit too. It would only be prudent. I hope people listening are able to taste some wines as well. But I have a couple here that are not related to Newsom or Pedernales, because I figured they'd be able to talk about theirs. And I think it's important to note that a lot of really great producers in Texas are making some great Tempranillo. So I have Spicewood Vineyards here. This is their estate Tempranillo. They do a really great job with this grape and have for a long time. And they do a High Plains version, also their estate, which is in the Hill Country. I also have the THP. This is from Llano Estacado, and the grapes are grown in far west Texas in a vineyard called Del Valley Vineyards in Del City. These grapes are really interesting. When we talk about far west Texas, we're talking, near El Paso out here in very, very different growing conditions at elevations of about 4,500 feet. So it's really interesting, right by the Guadalupe Mountains. And so this wine is really interesting to taste if you can get a hold of it. We also have RLV. This is their Toro, and these grapes are grown in the High Plains. And then finally, what I have in my glass is the Fall Creek Vineyards. This is their Tempranillo, specifically from the Salt Lake Vineyards, which is in Driftwood, Texas, between Austin and the Hill Country. And I particularly think the grapes from this vineyard are really neat because they, the soils are really different. They're really unique, coming off of the Onion Creek riparian zone. And these grapes tend to be just really, really concentrated in fruit and character. And they have that note that David talked about. That's kind of that cedary, smoky note. There's almost this, meaty charcuterie aspect to it. This is a 2017 recent release, and it's really, really nice. Neil, why don't you talk about what you have in your glass? This is it Inwood or?
Yeah, this is a 2017 Inwood. It's been open for about 45 minutes, and it's amazing how fast the nose has changed. I'm getting a really caramelized, tiny bit smoky nose, and maybe some really dark fruit in there. And then on the palate, plums, dark red cherries, a little bit of, it's not a fruit bomb, but it's definitely a little bit of a fruit forward wine. And also I think I can taste my caliche, a little bit of mineral as well. Wonderful.
Yeah, cheers. David, what do you have? I'm assuming, hopefully, a Pedernales.
Yeah, no, I actually have a High Plains 2016. And so this is actually a blend of a portion of Neil's vineyard as well as fruit from the Bingham vineyard, which is down the road from them. And, with this one, I get some of that red cherry that I was talking about, as well as just that, again, that kind of dusty component, but also it does pick up some nice kind of leather notes and a little coffee and chocolate to it. Anyway, this one is, I think it's 15 months of mostly American oak for us. We'll do about 40% new and 60% neutral for these typically when we're aging. So been in the bottle, let's see with this one, about a year plus now. So.
I think that, each of you kind of touched on something. There's definitely these kind of red fruit and dark fruit characteristics. But what I love about what's happening with Texas Tempranillo across the board is there are these wonderful tertiary earthy characteristics to it, whether it's, some of that cedar smokiness we're talking about in the Hill Country, or this minerally kind of dusty character. It just gives so much more depth and complexity to the wines. And I do think that is something that we have going for us as a state, and with this grape in particular. So I think it's neat to be able to taste through them all. As you mentioned, David, I do taste through a lot of them all at once together. And it's both a blessing and a curse because, you have to be sharp. You have to be paying attention. Yeah. But I love it because there's a reason we're talking about this grape, and it's because it is doing so well here. I want to make sure that we're clear that there are a lot of really great grape varieties that are growing in Texas. And I'm just curious, and we'll let each of you kind of expound on this, but where do you see the future of Texas wine going over the next 5 to 10 years? We've talked about some of the challenges in terms of weather, but if we're going to have people take something important away here, what do you want that to be, in terms of looking towards the future, and then also, grabbing a glass of Texas wine right now? We'll start with David.
Okay. As far as where it's going, it's already gone a lot further in the 13 years that I have been in this industry than I think I would have imagined. So I'm hoping that it continues to kind of outperform my expectations. And when we got into this business, you only had a handful of folks that were really doing full-scale commercial production of wine, and they were often working behind the curve as far as there's a lot more demand for the wines they made than there were necessarily even grapes in the ground. And we've watched that curve turn the other way as we're seeing more and more planting coming in. We see more than just Neil and some of those families putting grapes in the ground. We have a lot of really good farmers who are growing grapes, who are expanding their operations, and all of this makes it possible for us to continue to scale out Texas to not just Texas consumers, but to take Texas outside of the state to places where people can start to identify what is the particular unique characteristics of Texas wines. And so that is, for me, it's to where I want to be in 5 years, and definitely in 10 years with Texas, is that if you're talking to a sommelier around the country and you bring up Texas, that they'll be able to point to 2 or 3 particular reds and 2 or 3 particular whites and say, you know what, you should go check out the stuff in Texas, because this is where they're part of that conversation, or they might even be the best you're going to find for those particular things.
Yeah. Neil, what about you? I mean, especially from the growing perspective, what do you see for the next 5 to 10 years in terms of, mitigating the challenges y'all are dealing with, and then also your hope that people will take away from a grower's perspective about Texas wine?
Well, up. When we got interested in growing grapes, I think there were about a dozen wineries in Texas, and now there's 300 or 400 or 500. Every time you look somewhere, the number's huge. There's a lot more acreage now. We've got all of these varieties that are sellable now that most people haven't even heard of 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So we've got this huge envelope to pull from now. And we're learning what works here. Well, far west Texas, the hill country, wherever you are, there's some varieties that can be grown there that will make really nice wines. It's fun to see somebody that's never tasted a Texas wine, and they're kind of reluctant, or you think, well, I know I'm not going to like this, and when they finally do, their face goes, whoa, and they look around to see if you're watching them. I don't know what they're expecting, cactus and gunpowder, I guess. I don't know. Those days are gone. It's working really well. Buy local, that's been powerful. That's been really good for the Texas wine industry. People want to eat and buy local when they can.
Excellent. Well, this kind of wraps up our conversation today. I'm so grateful to both of you for joining us and helping give us perspective on Tempranillo in particular, but then also about kind of these different regions that we have here in Texas. And I should mention that we grow grapes in a lot of other places in the state, but it is the hill country and the high plains from which the majority of these grapes come from. And so I think it's important for the average Texas consumer to know that these are the foundational places for Texas wine. And it's also worth noting, I mean, I know I brought a couple of extra wines here. There are a lot of really great Tempranillos out there for you to try, and a lot of retailers more and more are carrying really great representations of Texas wine. So I hope you'll kind of explore the different Tempranillos that are available, and also, pick 2, 3, 4, 5 of your favorites. There doesn't have to be just one. But thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did, and you'll be back for our next Viva Texas Vino program. I want to give a special thanks to Neil Newsom from Newsom Vineyards and David Culkin from Tempranillo Cellars, and of course to Jessica Dupuy for co-hosting this program today. And if any of you are interested in checking out more programs from the Bullock Museum, you can always check out our website, thestoryoftexas.com, or our YouTube channel for more upcoming programs in the future. Thanks again.